Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eve Warburton. I'm the Director of the ANU Indonesia Institute at the College of Asia and the Pacific. As we commence, I want to first acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we're meeting tonight, the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, and I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past and present. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the 2023 Tony and Yohanni Johns lecture. This lecture series, as many of you will already know, was established with the very generous endowment of set up by Emeritus Professor Tony Reid. It's a series that is designed and that we hope will advance the cause of Southeast Asian studies in Australia and to really deepen the understanding of our region, while at the same time celebrating two of the giants of the field. And I would like now to really warmly welcome our guests of honour, Professor Tony Johns and Yohanni Johns, and to express to them how glad we are that you could both make it here tonight. And it's your legacy that we are celebrating again. I would also like to warmly welcome Professor Helen Sullivan, our Dean here at the College of Asia and the Pacific, and to express our gratitude to Professor Sullivan for her ongoing support for the study of Indonesia all around the campus, and in particular for her support of the Indonesia Institute. I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished speaker this evening, Professor Ronit Ricci, who will be indeed giving the address, the 2023 Tony and Yohanni Johns address, and I'll be giving you a few more details about introducing Ronit in just a few moments. And finally, a very warm welcome as well to Emeritus Professor Tony Reid, whose generous endowment, as I said, has made this lecture series possible. So to open our lecture this evening's event, I'm now pleased to welcome Professor Helen Sullivan to offer some opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eve, and it is a pleasure to be here again for this next lecture. I note that the giver of the inaugural lecture is in the audience, which is just wonderful. I too would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands and airwaves we meet, and pay my respect to elders past and present. It's really important, I think, as Eve's indicated, to take a moment to recognise and celebrate the pioneering contribution of Tony and Yohanni Johns to the study and teaching of Indonesian, Nusantara, and Islamic humanities at the ANU. Tony commenced as the inaugural Professor of Indonesian Languages and Literature at the ANU in 1963, and from that moment has been etched into the history books. As this annual lecture series was established to celebrate their enduring legacy, I am thrilled that both Tony and Yohanni are able to join us this evening, accompanied by family members, including, I think, a very young family member, which is just wonderful. I hope you're signing her up to the ANU. Somebody sign her up to the ANU. The ANU and the college in particular is deeply committed to the study of Indonesia and of Southeast Asia. This is most evident through the exceptional work of the ANU Indonesia Institute that Eve Warburton so wonderfully directs at the moment. And this year, as is ever evolving with our institutes, the Indonesia Institute has placed new emphasis on reaching out to and connecting scholars from very different parts of the university working on Indonesia, spanning earth sciences to economics, from art to design. The Institute is committed to supporting a new generation of Indonesia researchers through tailored activities for undergraduates and postgraduate students studying Indonesia here at ANU and indeed across Australia. And we take that role as part of the National University, we take that role of helping build capacity and capability across Australia very, very seriously. And some of the things that the Indonesia Institute has done in the past and will continue to do in the future are really important in that regard. In 2023, the Institute established new and deepened existing partnerships with other institutions on and off campus, including the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia, the Asian Studies Association of Australia, the National Security College here in the College of Asia and the Pacific, and the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association, among others. This lecture is an important activity on the College of Asia and the Pacific calendar, and I thank each of you for taking the time to be with us here this evening. It really is wonderful to have so many people from so many generations joining us. And finally, of course, I would like to thank and honor Professor Tony Reid and his wife, Dr. Helen Reid, for their leadership in establishing the fund that enables us to run this lecture series and to bring to the lecture such wonderful talent as indeed we will have this evening. So I'll hand back to Eve at this point. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished speaker for the evening, Professor Ronit Ricci. Professor Ricci is both a Professor of Asian Studies and Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she's also one of our own. She holds a position at the ANU School of Culture, History and Language. Professor Ricci has a PhD in Comparative Literature from the University of Michigan, and her scholarly interests span language study, translation, Islamic literary cultures from the regions of India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and across the Malay world. Professor Ricci also teaches language. She teaches Bahasa Indonesia, she taught courses in Islam and translation traditions in South and Southeast Asia. And her research has, over the years, attracted a lot of praise and many, many accolades, including the Polonsky Prize for Creativity and Originality in Humanities, the Harry Bender Prize in Southeast Asian Studies, and the American Academy of Religion's first book in the history of religions. From that extremely short and brief summary of her illustrious career, you will get a sense that Professor Ricci's research shares really important and deep synergies with that of Emeritus Professor Tony Johns. And that is why the Indonesia Institute felt this year that it was fitting for Professor Ricci to deliver the address. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Ronit Ricci.
So good evening, welcome everyone. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their leaders past and present. And thank you, Eve, for the kind introduction. It's very moving for me to be here and to see so many colleagues and friends. And it is, of course, also a great privilege to be invited to give this lecture honoring Tony and Yohanni Johns. Can you hear me okay? Just make sure, okay. Both Tony and Yohanni have made immense contributions to the study of Southeast Asia and Indonesia especially during their long and very productive and very distinguished careers at ANU. I will not list here all of their well-known accomplishments, publications, and the honors they received over the years, but I do want to say a few personal words. Unlike at least some of you, definitely not all, but some of you sitting in the audience here, I have not known this remarkable couple for decades, and only met them in person relatively recently, about 13 years ago, when I moved to Canberra and they were in their early 80s. And of course, I knew Tony's scholarship long before that, and I had read it and studied it, but I hadn't met them in person. Over the ensuing years, I became Tony's student, meeting with him regularly to read passages of Tafsir Jalalain, an interpretation of the Quran, and to consult with him on various texts that I was struggling to understand. Tony was always patient, always incredibly generous with his knowledge, always asking me probing questions, and always carried his erudition lightly and with a great sense of humor. Over the years, I was fortunate also to get to know Yohanni and acquire the seminal books for teaching the Indonesian language that she authored, and which I used for my own studying also, as Eve mentioned, when I taught Indonesian at the Hebrew University. I learned a great deal also from Yohanni's wisdom, her ability to overcome the many challenges an immigrant faces in a new country, and from the many insights about teaching, culture, family, and life that she shared. In my talk today, I will try to combine themes that I hope will speak to Tony's scholarship and also to Yohanni's deep knowledge of an engagement with that main gateway to any significant cultural understanding, and that is the gateway of language. I feel very fortunate to consider Tony and Yohanni among my teachers, my mentors, and my colleagues and dear friends. And again, I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. So what I would like to do in my talk today is speak on the topic of the tales of the prophets as they are told in Java. And the prophets in Java and also generally in Indonesia are known as nabis. Tony has been interested in the prophets' portrayal in the Quran and in other sources and has contributed significantly to the scholarship on this topic. And in his scholarship on the prophets, he has put special emphasis on the elements of human character and emotion as narrated in these tales, on their layers of textual meaning and on interpretation. In an attempt to situate these stories in a particular context, I will also introduce two more casts of characters. One is in addition to the nabis. So one is the students of Islam known as santri, and the third cast of characters are the men said to have introduced Islam to Java, the walis. I would like to suggest one way to think about these three groups, nabis, santris, and walis, together. And one big picture point that I would like to make at the start, if we take a step back from all of the specifics, is that when we look at Javanese literature generally, at Javanese texts, we can't help but notice or feel an abundance or a great richness. And what we see time and again is that there is a strong impulse of creativity and innovation in Java, which often rests, not always, but often rests on what we might think of as building blocks, tropes, figures, ideas, poetic forms adopted from elsewhere, sometimes from India, sometimes from the Middle East or Persia. But then these blocks, when put together in Java, make for new and different, sometimes even unique kinds of structures. We don't quite have, I feel, we don't quite have the right term for this phenomenon, for this abundance. And I don't mean to make it sound like something mystical that is indescribable, but it is something very powerful that is difficult to put into words. And I think it's a phenomenon we also see in the Javanese language with its vast vocabulary, and also in arts and architecture. But if we think of the word intertextuality, for example, or similar terms, they certainly seem too pale or insufficient. And so this phenomenon is something I want you to please keep in mind, also for these stories of the prophets. And what I called in my abstract for this talk and what I will speak about, which is a wali Ambiya or wali Nabi interface. So here you can see some of Tony's contributions on the prophets over the past quarter of a century. It's not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the articles and chapters that he has written. This goes from 1999 to now. And in the book that you see here, The Dialogue, which was published just a few months ago, because Tony is still writing and publishing more than people who are much, much younger. In this book, so in addition to the list you see here, in this book, there are no less than 6 chapters on the prophets of Islam. So you can imagine it's a little bit daunting to speak about the subject in front of Tony, but I think that would be the case for almost any subject I would choose. So I'm risking it. Okay, so Just to give you a little bit of an introduction about these tales of the prophets as they're known, this is, of course, this is not a specifically Javanese tradition. The stories of the prophets' lives form a central textual tradition of a global Islamic civilization. They're told in many languages, in many genres and places. And what they do is they recount the deeds and the sayings of many figures that are viewed as prophets in Islam. So some of them are known also from the Jewish and Christian traditions, but in those traditions, they might be viewed as kings or different types of figures, but for Muslims, they are prophets. And these begin with Adam, who is the first human, but also the first prophet, according to Islam, and inevitably lead up through many other prophets to the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad, who is considered the seal of the prophets. The Javanese stories are derived from a text called the Sêrat Ambiya, which is the Arabic version of these tales. And we know that the earliest Arabic versions date to the 1st or 2nd century of the Islamic era. But it is not clear at all on which tellings these Javanese versions or these Javanese tellings are based on, or when they first arrived in the archipelago. So there are various theories about this, where they came from, what language they were translated from. Was it Arabic or Persian? What was the route that they took to get to Java? But we're not quite sure. So be the precise transmission history as it may, in Java, these texts, which are known as Sêrat Ambiya or Layang Ambiya. So Ambiya again comes, Nabi is the singular Nabi, or Nabi as it's pronounced in Indonesia, is the singular for prophet, Anbiya is prophets, and then in Java it becomes Ambiya. This corpus in Java contains one of the largest number of different tellings within a single Javanese textual tradition, and it possesses a very complex history. So I didn't say, but what you see here are 3 examples from the Indonesian archipelago or Indonesian communities. This one is from the Keraton, Yogyakarta. The one on the left is actually not from Java, it's from the colonial diaspora, the Malay colonial diaspora in Ceylon, Sri Lanka. So it's a Malay Ambiya, and this is just to show the different materials in which these texts were written on. This is a Lontar manuscript. And here we have just one example from the Persian world. This is from 16th century Iran, where you can see an illustration of Noah on the ark. So in Java, this corpus has enjoyed great popularity as the lives of the prophets, as you can imagine, serve as models for the believer. And any kind of engagement with these texts, whether you're a copier, a writer, a listener, someone who stores the text, any such engagement was viewed as bringing rewards. For example, producing merit that equals visiting the Kaaba many times, or going on pilgrimage to all of the prophets' graves. And just to give you one example of the variability of these texts, these manuscripts, in the Sono Budaya Museum in Yogyakarta, which has a sort of a really important manuscript collection, there are 30 of these Ambiya manuscripts, of which no 2 are the same. And this variability is very, very interesting, but of course it's also made a systematic study of this corpus very challenging, and it would take at least one lifetime, but probably more, to actually go through all of these texts, or even some of them, and actually try to compare them and understand their structure and their differences. The Ambiya corpus is central to Javanese Islam, to imagining and internalizing what I like to think of as a history of everything: the creation of the world and the early history of humanity, major developments before and leading up to the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad, his legacy and the history of early Islam. These texts also contain a model for correct or good behavior and attitudes that a Muslim should have in this life. They contain the rituals that one should conduct. And also they talk a lot about, through these tales, about the most fundamental of human relationships. So for example, parents and children, siblings, king and his subjects, husband and wife, of course, master and slave. And through these relationships, the text also engages with a range of emotional responses and social situations, or what we might think of as the meaning, what it means to be human in particular cultural contexts. So we don't know exactly when, where, and how often these Ambiya were read in the past, but copies are found in many manuscript collections, including those belonging to or written at pesantren, that is Islamic pedagogical settings. And today when we use the word pesantren, we call them in English Islamic boarding schools. And so here I would like to share with you an example of a manuscript, the Ambiya manuscript from such a setting, on which I will focus for the rest of my talk. So this manuscript is from a pesantren milieu in central Java from the mid-19th century. And as you can see, it's written in Pegon, which is the Javanese language written in the Arabic script. And it's written in Mochopat, in Bang Mochopat, which are the Javanese poetic meters in which almost all of Javanese literature in the 18th, at least from the 18th or late 17th century into the 20th were written. And this means that the texts were not, they definitely weren't read silently, but they were also not just read out like prose, but rather they were always recited or sung. So it's interesting to see this from the exact same period. We have manuscripts also written in the Javanese script and telling the exact same stories and written in the same meters. And yet there is the question here of the script, and did it form some kind of a barrier, or how people decided what script to use for a particular text. This manuscript is very explicitly meant for teaching the young. It was written by someone called Kiai Ahmed Nali. And as you can see here, it has 560 pages. This is not the longest Ambiya manuscript, but they tend to be very long and very detailed. And this again has something to do with this richness of telling stories. The illustrations that accompany it also convince us that it was indeed a very good tool for teaching children or young people, because it's always more interesting to look at pictures when you listen to a story. And one of the things that it shows us is that within the 19th century world of the pesantren, the students known as santri, for the students, there was a place for storytelling. This is the opening page, and this is just to show you an example of an illustration. I think this is Joseph and Zuleika. So I would like to make a brief detour to introduce the second set of characters, who are the santri, by telling you a bit about the institution of the pesantren, the place of the santri, the educational institution that became so central to Javanese Islam. And again, there are people here who study the pesantren in the present and know a lot about it, and probably who are products of that system of education. So it's an institution that became very, very important. In the 18th and 19th centuries, in sources produced in the 18th and 19th centuries in Javanese, the santri is depicted as a person who is typically young, who wandered in search of knowledge, and above all, religious Islamic knowledge. And these santri, as they're depicted, often sat at the foot of a teacher and then another teacher. So they moved among different teachers in order to learn how to live life as a good Muslim. So usually we say a wandering student of Islam. That's like the typical description. The teachers were called Kiai and were often men who returned from the Hajj, possessed deep knowledge and were revered for it and also for their charismatic personality. And staying with such a teacher or a guru was not only an intellectual experience, but it included service to the teacher and his family. And if you were an especially smart santri, you might even get to marry the Kiai's beautiful daughter. In terms of history, so we have these descriptions in the literature, but in terms of history, we know little of the development of the more established Pesantren institutions. So there has been some, of course, there has been some research about this. And for example, Martin van Boonessem, in his book about the Pesantren, talks about the development of the Pesantren in Java, suggesting that the first Pesantren proper were not established before the 18th century. And that prior to that, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Islamic disciplines were taught at the mosque or at the court, and masters of mystical magical sciences were based mainly in hermitages or near sacred graves. And indeed, for example, in the Sêrat Centini, which is probably the main Javanese text that we have that describes the journey of santris crossing Java. It was originally written in the 18th century. We don't have the word Pesantren, but we do have the word asrama, which of course comes from Sanskrit. Ashram or ashrama is a hermitage, or used to be a hermitage. And we also have the word paguron, which comes from the word guru. So maybe something similar to what we see in this photograph, where a small group of disciples sat around the guru and studied with him. The Pesantren may have developed in part out of these various locations, and also probably from a pre-Islamic model of intense study, aesthetic practices, and the like. In the 19th century, this institution continued to develop and change. And today, if you look this up, there are apparently around 30,000 Pesantren across Indonesia. But even though it's become such a central institution, an extensive study on the historical development of the Pesantren and its curriculums and pedagogical practices is yet to be written. So we really don't know enough about its history. And okay, this is an earlier version. There were already cameras around. It's not very early, but I think it captures something of the more traditional setting. And this is one of the oldest modern Pesantrens in Yogyakarta. So before going back to the tales of the prophets, I will now move on to the third group of figures after speaking about the Nabis and the Santris, and these are the Wali. So the gradual tradition of Java to Islam is often narrated and remembered in the traditions of the Wali Songo, the 9 Walis or saints, quote unquote saints, said to have come from afar or to have had a foreign lineage and to have brought Islam to Java. And this is, of course, the way they're represented now. This is a contemporary representation. I already noted that the Pesantren may have emerged from earlier pedagogical settings like the Paguron or the Asrama. And these institutions, of course, changed over time along with the religious transition. And I think the Walis too can be seen as, in some ways, as transitional figures who had one foot in the pre-Islamic Java. Not that they were not Muslims, but they were men who are said to have accommodated earlier practices and beliefs. This is the main thing that is told and retold about them, that they accepted their earlier beliefs and then one foot planted very firmly in the world of Islam. These figures are credited with many miracles that convinced people to convert, like curing the sick or ending a drought, but also with bringing to Java some central elements of what are now considered classical Javanese culture. So, for example, Sunan Bonang is credited with creating the bonang, the musical instrument, part of the gamelan. And Sunan Kalijogo is credited with creating the wayang kulit. the shadow puppet theater. And today these men figure very prominently within the world of the ANU, the Nadlatul Ulama, and Islam Nusantara, but the tales about them are much, much earlier and found in many manuscripts. And here I would like to say that anyone who wants to know about contemporary practices of pilgrimage to the wali's graves and the stories told about them should read, if you haven't already, George Quinn's wonderful book, The Bandit Saints of Java. Now to try and connect the Santri, the Pesantren institution, the walis, and the Ambiya, or the Nabis. So in some of these Ambiya tales, the figures of the walis and the prophets, two core groups of figures for Javanese Islam, seem to have merged. Although it's important to say that the walis are never actually mentioned explicitly. So what I am going to talk about now is my interpretation of the way I see it, but the Nabis are the one who populate these tales, and the walis are only there as echoes or as fragments. And this I refer to as a wali-ambiya interface. And I would like to return to the manuscript to offer you two examples. So I want you to imagine a setting in which the Santris in this Pesantren, the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, are listening to these examples from the Ambiya. So I have two examples I will share, and this is the first one. What you see here is at the end of the story I'm going to tell. So after the episode of nearly sacrificing his son Ismail, so, you know, there are two sort of traditions about who Ibrahim almost sacrificed. So in the Islamic tradition, he almost sacrificed his son Ismail. So Ibrahim or Abraham returns home and tells his son Ismail and Ishaq, Isaac, that he has received three boons from God. And one of them is the commandment to spread the faith. In light of this, he wishes to build a mosque in Mecca. And as he goes about preparing for this task and gathering all the necessary construction materials, he finds that one pillar for the structure is still missing. He searches for a big slab of stone, but he cannot find one. Then finally, he meets a man who has such a slab, but the man refuses to give it to him or even to sell it to him. Ibrahim turns to God, and following his plea, the man who has the slab of stone has a dream in which a very old man appears, telling him to quickly give the stone to Ibrahim, lest he meet misfortune in this world and the next. And this is the very short section that you see. He tells him, you had better deliver it to Ibrahim, and then he wakes up, the man wakes up, and he finds Ibrahim and tells him he will give him this slab of stone. Ibrahim accepts it. Nabi Ibrahim, he's also a prophet in the story, accepts it. And then the Masjid al-Haram, whose plan you can see here from the manuscript in Mecca, is erected. And the Muslims are led by Nabi Ibrahim as Imam. This recalls, I think, the story of the founding of the mosque in Demak, Java's first Islamic kingdom, situated on the north coast in the 15th century. As the story goes, a day before the mosque was completed, one of the main four pillars was still missing. Sunan Kalijogo, who is, in most versions, he's the leader of the 9 walis, collected bits of wood, and it wasn't even bits of wood, it was more like sawdust. And he was able to miraculously connect all of these bits together so that they became a large, heavy pillar without which the mosque could not be completed. And here you see the mosque in Demak, and this is Sunan Kalijogo's tomb. Nabi Ibrahim in Mecca is the progenitor of all Muslims, father of Ismail, from whose line the Prophet Muhammad would be born. Both he, that is Ibrahim, and Sunan Kalijogo are father figures. Ibrahim for the entire Muslim community, and Sunan Kalijogo for Javanese Muslims. And the two structures they erected were to become foundational mosques in different corners of the Muslim world. The mosques in Mecca and Damak are connected through this episode as they are linked to additional stories. And there are also stories of connections made more broadly between the holy cities and Java. As in the reports, you might have also heard of this, the reports of Sultan Agung, who was the ruler of Mataram, who is said to have gone every Friday to visit the Prophet's mosque and bring back handfuls of Mecca's earth. And I mentioned earlier building blocks in coming from outside Java and the creation of new structures or new text. I think we can think of these handfuls of earth as a kind of building block as well, because gradually these handfuls of Mecca's earth piled up into a mound, which is known today as Imogiri, where Javanese kings have been buried ever since Sultan Agung's time. So the kings of Java were buried in Java, and yet they were also in a way buried in the sacred earth of Mecca. In this way, the analogous stories of Ibrahim and Kalijogo connect not only the men's biographies, but also their proselytizing efforts, the two mosques, and Java with Arabia. The pillar indispensable to the building of the mosque is a central component that connects all the parts into a single whole and allows the mosque to stand stable and constant for many centuries and to remain a focal point for the Muslim community. And in both these stories, we see that the solution to the missing pillar is attained miraculously, pointing to divine intervention and guidance at the creation moment of the mosque and also of the new Muslim community. In the second example, and I'm sorry, I didn't have, there's no illustrations of that in the manuscript, so I have to show you. These are just from contemporary Indonesian comic books or about which continue to tell these stories. But the second example is the episode of the Israelites' desire to be ruled by a king of their own. They turn to Nabi Ismail, who is in English Samuel, asking who shall rule over them, and express the wish that it will be Ismail himself. But he replies that the role will be filled by Talut, and Talut is the biblical Saul. The people are appalled by this idea because they claim that Talut is just a lowly, poor tanner, and therefore unfit for kingship. Ismail then retorts that he has been given a sign by God that will allow him to know who is the one destined to rule. And that is the person who will be the first to see the Ark of the Covenant. And so the people go quickly into the mountains, a search into the mountains and into the forest. But Talut is the one who encounters the Ark, which glows like the moon descending on a mountaintop. And then the Ark is brought before Ismail, and he tells the people, all of the Israelites, to open it. And they all try, but no one succeeds until Talut tries, and he is able to open the Ark. Once it has been opened, all those present see its contents, and the contents is the royal regalia, including a garment. Everyone tries it on, again, one by one, but once again, no one succeeds. It's either too tight or too loose for everyone until Talut dons it and it fits perfectly, and he becomes king. So here we find the biography not of a prophet, as in the case of Ibrahim, but of a king, but still an Ambiya figure, linked to that of a wali. And again, this wali is Sunan Kalijogo. The story of the sign sent by God to indicate that Talut is destined to be king echoes with another story about Sunan Kalijogo. After a long argument amongst the walis over the true Qibla, that is, the Qibla is the direction of prayer towards Mecca, and they have an argument because it was not so easy at the time, sitting in Java to know exactly where to turn to face Mecca, and finally there is a scene where they reorient the mosques in Damak and Mecca towards one another. So after that, they were having a discussion at the Damak mosque when they saw a parcel wrapped in sheepskin dropping from the sky. With his staff, Sunan Bonang was able to pick at it, and it dropped down. And so when they opened the parcel, they find two items. One is a letter and one is a beautiful vest. The letter was from the Prophet Muhammad telling Sunan Kalijogo that the Prophet was rewarding him with his own garment, and that he should wear it in this world and the next, taking the Prophet's place. So he's actually announced to be the Khalifa, taking the Prophet's place in the world. And further, the letter commanded Sunan Kalijogo should make this sheepskin from the parcel into a garment that will be of great benefit in the future. So then they sew this sheepskin into a garment, and in the section of the story that most recalls the story of Talut, the walis, one after another, again tried on, and they tried to wear this newly made garment, but to no avail. It was either too loose or too tight for all, until Sunan Kalijogo donned it, and it fit him perfectly. Sunan Bonang, understanding this garment test as a sign from above, declares Sunan Kalijogo as the one who will instill the faith in Java. So the analogy suggested in this second example is between two figures, a wali and a king, who were chosen to lead in extraordinary and perhaps unlikely circumstances. Talut, the poor man of humble origins, whom God destined to be the first king of Israel, and Kalijogo, the former robber, because before his career as a wali, he was a thief, whom the Prophet appointed as his heir on earth on a tropical island far from the traditional centers of Islam. In both cases, a sign was sent from the heavens that would provide a concrete manifestation of the role bestowed upon these figures. And in both instances, that initial sign, so the appearance of the ark and also of this bundle, was insufficient to persuade the doubtful. Thus, the first sign was followed by a second definitive test involving rare garments, the royal heirloom for Talut and the heavenly sheepskin turned garment for Kalijogo, with both seemingly custom-made for the predestined ones and ill-fitted for anyone else who donned them. And here, as I near the end of my talk, you have a few more beautiful illustrations to look at. This is, again, Noah's Ark, Noah and his sons in the Ark. This is Dewi Sarah, so Sarah, Ibrahim's wife, and you can see that she's enclosed in a box or a chest or a treasure chest. And this is a recurring motif in the Ambiya. There are many different folk motifs that we are familiar with from other parts of the world, other stories, fairy tales, what we would maybe call fairy tales. And one of them is these treasure chests that appear every so often, and there's always someone inside, and they always open up and something happens or someone appears at an unexpected moment. This is Sarah, and this is Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, with Moses. And I would love to collaborate with an art historian in studying this manuscript if there are any volunteers, because I think, there's so much that we have yet to learn from a manuscript like this. So not just reading the content, reading the stories, but the colors, the use of the portrayal of human beings, which here look very much like wayang characters, the dress, the architecture. Okay, so to almost conclude, I'd like to say that these were just two examples, and there are quite a few more in this manuscript. And the aim of exploring what I think of as the Wali Ambiya interface was not to perfectly map one set of stories onto another. Rather, I would like to suggest that through evoking the Walis and Ambiya figures' common biographical episodes within one of Java's most popular literary corpuses, told and retold to 19th century santris learning the path of Islam, two great traditions of Islamic history were woven into one. And this process, perhaps contested, perhaps left behind, dichotomies, familiar dichotomies of Arab and local Islam, so-called authentic or syncretic Islam, ancient and more recent, and invited the reader or listener of the Ambiya to imagine these canonical figures as belonging to one and the same realm. The text suggests, and here I go back to my opening point on the difficult to put into words richness of these texts. They really are like echo chambers that keep echoing and creating and recreating with similar tropes and words and ideas. So the text suggests a certain interchangeability between the two categories of figures, one that fits with a broader phenomenon within Javanese literature, like I said, within the Javanese language and the Javanese arts and architecture, in which characters, tropes, and images are often interchangeable, borrowable, expandable, and imaginable across media and genres, leading to new possibilities or new expressive modes. This is my final slide. The birds, there are many birds in this manuscript, and in the manuscript I talked about today. And here, when you see them, they have the role of indicating a change of meter. It's called sasmita tembang in Javanese, and this is a cue for the reciter. Because, again, because all of these texts were sung and recited with these poetic meters, typically in the final line of the final verse of a canto or a chapter, there would be a word, the sasmita tembang, this cue, there would be a word that was either a synonym for the name of the next meter, the upcoming meter, or a word that had a similar sound. And then the experienced reciter would just know. They would reach the last line and they would have this word and they would know, okay, now I need to switch to this meter or that meter. But here the birds hint at a shift rather than words. They're using the birds. It's a shift to a meter known called dandangulo, which is a very popular meter, often indicated by synonyms for the word gulo, which means sweet or sugar or sweetness. So you often have a word that's either a synonym for gulo or sounds like gulo. But dandang, so the first part of the name of the meter, is also a name of a bird. And here, instead of a word that would act as a cue for the reciter, he could see the illustrated birds and know it's time to switch to a new meter. These birds remind me of Tony and Yohanni. They always appear in pairs or couples, close, looking into one another's eyes, loving together. I will conclude by saying that in addition to all their very significant intellectual contributions and their success in building a thriving Indonesian studies community here in Canberra, Tony and Yohanni have offered all of us, no less importantly, a model of partnership, cooperation, generosity, mutual respect, support, and love that has remained constant over many years. For that and everything else they have taught me and taught and given all of us, a heartfelt thank you, Tony and Yohanni. And thank you all for coming and for being here to celebrate these two remarkable careers and remarkable human beings.
Thank you so much, Professor Ricci, for an incredibly rich, fascinating, and very moving presentation, a wonderful tribute to the legacy of Tony and Yohanni Johns. I've had the pleasure of listening to Ronit speak about her research on a couple of occasions now, and I'm just always struck by how skillfully and beautifully Ronit is able to evoke for us a picture of the stories that are being told in these texts. And I feel, and I think we all feel, so very fortunate that you are able to be here tonight and to give the address this year. And we're also, I think, very fortunate, very grateful that you are a part of our scholarly community here at the ANU and our community of Indonesianists and people who work on and love Indonesia. So please join me again in thanking Ronit for helping. This brings the 2023 Tony and Yohanni Johns lecture to a close. There's always lots of people to thank when putting together an event like this. This year in particular, I wish to thank the entire team at the College of Asia and the Pacific's Advancement Office. They worked really hard to make sure this evening has gone smoothly. And so I wish to thank them all, particularly Lawrence, who has worked hard on this project this evening. We have refreshed, and I also want to thank, of course, you all for being here this evening to celebrate the life and legacy of Tony and Yohanni Johns. And it's really wonderful and warming, I think, to see people from so many different generations who work on Indonesia and who care about Indonesia and who care about sustaining the study of Indonesia and maintaining ANU's sort of identity as a centre for the study of Indonesia in Australia and indeed globally. So thank you very much for being here, and please stay for refreshments, for some food and some wine. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you all at the next ANU Indonesia Institute event. Thank you very much.